welcome to episode 8 of the CRICKETher Vodcast in social isolation. We've been doing this for 2 months now and we keep thinking that we're going to run out of stuff to say, and it hasn't happened yet.
Stuff keeps happening.
As we've done every week, we're in a special location this week, thanks to the magic of green screen, and to celebrate the launch of the Cricketish Cup, about which more later, but that's a little cricket competition that we're running, which is going to take place in cyberspace. So this week, we're doing the social isolation podcast in cyberspace.
Yeah.
So there we are. That explains the slightly strange background. Now, we've had a couple of big things this week. We've had Clare Connor talking to the media, which we're going to get to later. But before Clare Connor spoke, we actually had Tom Harrison speaking to the committee in Parliament for the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. It's a bit of a mouthful. But Tom Harrison was up there to talk about culture and media and sport, I guess. Raf was paying attention, so the rest of us don't have to. Raf, what did Tom Harrison have to say?
They're doing this special parliamentary it's called the Select Committee. They're investigating the impact of COVID-19 on sport, basically. So Tom Harrison was giving evidence on that. And in terms of women's cricket, he said a couple of things. So he did I think the exact quote was, we'll do whatever we can and whatever is within our power to protect women's cricket, because he was specifically asked by the chair of the committee about the plans for women's and girls cricket. So he said that, so there was a bit of reassurance there. On the other hand, he did definitively stop short of saying that the £20 million investment in the women's and girls game, which was meant to be happening in 2020 and 2021, was ring-fenced, and that was the term that he contested. He said, no, I'm not ring-fencing that. To be fair, he also said that given that this is such a time of great uncertainty, I can't ring-fence any elements of the game. So it's not that the women's game was being treated differently to other aspects of the game. However, it did rather contrast with what we'd been told a few weeks ago by the ECB when we published our piece about the Centres of Excellence, the plans for those being to some extent put on hold. But we'd been reassured that investment, that £20 million investment, was going to remain in place and had been ring-fenced. And obviously, actually, what Tom Harrison's now saying is that it hasn't. So that's, a little bit of a concern maybe.
And Tom Harrison also put some kind of cold hard numbers on the amount that the ECB potentially stands to lose. What were those numbers, Raf, and just how worrying are they?
Well, obviously relates to what I've just said about the fact that he doesn't feel able to ring fence any elements of the game in such a time of crisis. If no cricket is played this summer, then the ECB will lose £380 million, he reckons. So that's the worst case scenario. On the other hand, the best case scenario, obviously the season's already been disrupted. If they can get some semblance of matches underway in July, August and September, the ECB will still lose £100 million. So that's quite a substantial amount of money.
It certainly is, yeah. So that was Tom Harrison at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Tom Harrison was followed by another TH, Tim Hollingsworth. He's the Chief Executive of Sport England. Is that what used to be called the Sports Council, Raf?
It did, yes.
And what did he have to say about women's sport in general?
Yeah, it was quite interesting because I think a lot of cricket people sort of turned off after Tom Harrison departed, but they did also have evidence from other people. So Tim Hollingsworth was asked specifically by another member of the committee about women's sport and what Sport England are doing to protect women's sport and what they feel that the impact might be on women's sport. And I thought it was actually quite interesting. Obviously, this is a topic that's kind of close to my heart and my own research interests. So Sport England have got this community support fund in place. I think it's actually worth £20 million. And this is obviously much more at a more of a grassroots level than some of the other initiatives or some of the high up stuff that the ECB has been talking about. So this is
the kind of thing that cricket clubs might be able to apply for?
I think so. I think it's a fund that's intended to support local clubs that might be struggling at this time to maintain facilities or whatever without any income, and also sort of community level organisations that are running sport. So the idea is to try and provide some support at that more local grassroots level. But the interesting thing about this fund in relation to the question about women's sport is that actually Sport England are apparently putting conditions on the money, and they're saying that they're only prepared to support clubs or community organisations who are giving priority to women's sport and who are showing that they are spending some of that money or an equal amount of that money on the women's game, on the women's side of things. So I thought that was actually really positive, because I am genuinely concerned that the pandemic represents a kind of existential threat to women's sport more generally, and obviously women's cricket specifically. So it sounds like some initiatives are kind of being put in place to try and safeguard against that.
Okay, thank you. And then we had the main event. Was it on Wednesday, the main event? We had the big fight, the big matchup, the rumble in the jungle. We had Clare Connor versus members of the press live on Zoom.
It was Zoom.
They chose not to use House Party this time.
You just described Clare Connor as the rumble in the jungle. I don't know if that's appropriate.
So the press zoomed in on Clare Connor, she talked for around about an hour, didn't she, to answering questions from various members of the press, and you know, they ran through a lot of the issues facing women's cricket, and she talked about various different things. So let's start with what Clare had to say about internationals and the prospect of playing internationals in England women playing this summer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, on the one hand, there was some really kind of positive news and a positive message, because it had been reported earlier in the week by the Daily Mail that, England women's test series against India, that was non-existent, but the Mail had reported that there would be no women's international cricket this summer, basically, or that was a big risk. And Clare basically said, well, that piece is nonsense. That's not a direct quote, but reading between the lines, what she was trying to say was that the ECB are working really hard to try and get some women's internationals happening this summer. They're in negotiations, or they're in discussions with the BCCI about England women's series v India being postponed, or being rearranged to later in the summer. So I guess that would be kind of at some point in August or September. And then obviously she said that as far as they're concerned at the moment, the international series that was meant to be happening against South Africa in September is still going ahead as planned. Now obviously we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it, and she did kind of acknowledge that they've got to make plans for perhaps in case that doesn't happen. But she did say that women's cricket is at the heart of these plans that are being developed to try and build a biosecure environment whereby cricket can take place behind closed doors.
And of course there is a big hole in the calendar now, isn't there? Now that they've officially accepted that the 100 isn't going to happen, that leaves August potentially open. If they can, you know, persuade the Indians to come over in August, then there's a potential window when that could happen. But of course there was some slightly less good news about internationals, wasn't there? Because Clare also talked realistically about the priorities in terms of the England men's team and playing men's tests and then playing the women's internationals, didn't she? What did she have to say there?
Yeah, well, I think she was trying to be realistic, and I have some sympathy with what she was saying, because essentially what she admitted was that the priority in terms of the safeguarding the future of the game has to be in bringing in some revenue this summer. And you know, we do kind of know that actually it's the men's internationals that bring in the vast majority of that revenue, and that as far as staging a women's international in a biosecure environment goes, actually it will probably cost you more than it would bring in revenue. I think that's fair to say. And so she kind of said, well, you know, I'm being realistic, and I think that if we want that 20 million investment in the women's and girls game to be safeguarded over the next couple of years, or for us to still have that money available to spend on women's and girls cricket, it's fair enough that if we've got a limited amount of days in the calendar, and particularly a limited number of venues that will be biosecure, because you know, they're looking at venues that have a hotel attached, of which there's only a couple, aren't there? Or even, I think there was a George de Bell piece that said they're looking at a couple of other venues maybe where there's accommodation nearby. But they're going to be very limited in what they can stage in this biosecure environment, kind of behind closed doors way. So yeah, she basically said that the men's internationals are going to take priority. And if there's only a certain number of days cricket that they can run, then it might be that therefore we don't see any women's international cricket this summer. So that would obviously be a very sad and disappointing state of affairs, but it's possible.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it would be disappointing, but that may be the way that we go. And what about domestic cricket? What about the cricket itself? You know, she did briefly mention the county stuff, didn't she? And she kind of said that the county stuff is probably not going to happen. But she did still express some thoughts about what might happen in terms of the actual cricket with the Centres of Excellence, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. So in terms of the county stuff, she did give a nod to that, and she basically said, well, as far as kind of the categorisation goes, that's recreational cricket, as we know, and therefore they have to follow the government advice specifically about recreational cricket or recreational sport more generally, which is that at the moment it's not safe to do that. And it may be that recreational sport takes longer to get going again than some of this other stuff. But in terms of the Centres of Excellence stuff, that's obviously a level above recreational, and those fixtures weren't actually due to take place until September, I believe. So she said, again, it's similar to the South Africa stuff in a way, that the Centres of Excellence fixtures may well be able to go ahead as planned in September, but we've got to cross that bridge when we come to it.
Okay, and then talking about the Centres of Excellence, she also talked a bit about the domestic contracts. So we were talking coming into the season about there being 40 shiny new contracts to be handed to domestic players, so players at a level below the England professionals, to kind of add weight to our domestic game. What did Claire have to say about the 40 new contracts?
Well, she first of all she repeated what we'd already published on CRICKETher, that those domestic contracts are on hold at the moment. They're not going to be issued. I think she used the date, the 1st of May, that they were meant to come into force. Now that's that date seems to have been a bit fluid in terms of how we might have, because we'd been told April for them to be starting, or maybe later in the season, and it's possible that actually the plans were already being slightly delayed even before the pandemic, and that some of this stuff has actually covered up what was already a delay in the contracts being issued. But as it stands now, the contracts are on hold. She did say that they're hopeful that they may be able to introduce them by the end of the year. So even if there's no cricket, even if there are no fixtures played for the Centres of Excellence, it's possible that they can get these contracts set up sort of at the end of the season, I suppose. So you're looking at autumn starts. So that would therefore mean, because these contracts are meant to be professional, run year round, and therefore you expect a year-round full-time commitment from the players, they'd be able to have a sort of full-time winter training schedule, and they'd be being paid to do that. So she said they're hopeful that something might happen by the end of the year, which is good news, because obviously we're hearing all the time about players. Naomi Ditani did an interview with the BBC this week. We've also heard from Alex Hartley, people like that, who were really banking quite a lot financially on these contracts coming into force. Literally banking on these contracts. How else are they going to pay rent or mortgage or whatever it is? How else are they going to kind of fund themselves for the next few months? And that's a real genuine concern for some of these domestic players. And
Claire also gave a hint of perhaps some help for those people as well in the interim, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. So we're waiting on a kind of formal announcement from the ECB about this. They're hoping that in a few weeks there'll be a few more details that they'll be able to actually announce. But she said that they're in conversations to try and negotiate some kind of, she called it a retainer. So the idea is that it will be a little bit of money, almost like a kind of token amount in a way. I don't think it's going to do I get the impression it's not going to do a huge amount in terms of actually making players able to pay their bills. But Claire talked about it more in terms of it being a way to keep players motivated, to keep them interested in cricket, to try and kind of say, well, yes, you are going to get your contract, it might be a bit delayed, but please bear with us, and here's a kind of nice gesture in the meantime, to show that we support you and that we don't want you to go off and do something else. We don't want to lose you to cricket. And I think that's really important, because otherwise the ECB potentially stand to lose a bit of a generation of players who are kind of caught between these two stools, and don't quite know what the future holds. So it feels like, even though we don't have loads of details, these retainers aren't going to be worth loads of money, but at least it's something, I suppose.
Okay, well, tough times. So The other thing that we've announced this week is, there's no real cricket going on, but we've announced a bit of fun for fans and things to get a little bit involved with, which is the Cricketish Cup.
Yeah, it's around here somewhere.
You have the actual trophy, the beautiful trophy. If you like, hold that up for everyone to see, Raf.
You just called me Rash.
It's a tough gig, this presenting thing, Raf. So that's the beautiful Cricketish Cup, and they'll be playing for that in cyberspace in a couple of weeks' time over the next bank holiday weekend. And what we wanted to do really was to kind of do something fun that keeps women's county cricket, a little bit in the spotlight. So we've entered in everybody's stats from last year into a big database, and we're going to play some virtual cricket matches in cyberspace. And at the end of it, there'll be a winner, and there'll be a Cricketish Cup. So that's something to look forward.
Are we actually going to present this to one of the teams?
Virtually.
Next year.
Virtually, we'll kind of hand it to them over cyberspace.
In person next year, we could actually hand it over.
We can always hope there is a next year.
That's a bit grim, Syd.
Oh dear. Anyway, thank you for that, Raf. And then finally this week, one other piece of potentially good news is something called the Trans-Tasman Travel Bubble. Raf, what's that all about, and how is it important for women's cricket potentially?
You're making it sound a lot more exciting and glamorous than it actually is. So essentially, as we know, Australia and New Zealand have seem to have done quite well at getting the pandemic under control in both their countries. Certainly much better than we've done in the UK. So it looks like the two governments are likely to open up their borders to each other before anyone from the rest of the world can come in. So essentially it means that you'll be able to travel freely between Australia and New Zealand without any of this quarantine malarkey that you have to go through for the rest of the world, or people can't actually even come in.
So what are the implications for women's cricket there?
Well, I think it's really good news, potentially, because obviously it means that if we're looking to try and get some internationals back happening, then Australia and New Zealand can play each other, and it'll be a much simpler thing logistically to organise than obviously some of these other things that are being talked about with teams having to quarantine and have biosecure environments, etc. So that could be really good. I guess in terms of the Women's Big Bash League, which obviously isn't due to start until October this year, but there'd already been kind of murmurs. I know Beth Mooney gave an interview a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, saying that it'll be this really great opportunity for the domestic players because they were anticipating having to play WBBL with no overseas. And actually what this does is say, well, you will have Susie Bates, you will have Rachel Priest, you will have Sophie Devine, who was obviously last year's player of the tournament and had a great kind of successful season last year. So even though you'll have a diminished number of overseas players, there will still be some of those big names, and that will make it, I guess, a better competition ultimately. So I think it's good news for women's cricket. Great,
and then perhaps looking forward to the World Cup, which is scheduled to take place in New Zealand. We could, Australia could still visit New Zealand for the World Cup. I mean, let's face it, they're probably going to win it anyway. And they could play all the group matches just between themselves.
Australia v New Zealand, Australia v New Zealand.
37 group matches. They could play both semi-finals and the final, and it would be great. So
that's true. New Zealand could win.
They could do, although they probably wouldn't. Sorry, New Zealand.
That's a bit harsh.
Okay, well that's all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back here the same time next week. Until then, take care and all the best.